They were forgotten, left to freeze on the riverbank while the world hurried by. One old man, sick and homeless, and one battered German shepherd, cast out from every warm place in Portland. No food, no shelter, just hunger, cold, and a hope that refused to die. No one noticed them, until an off-duty cop saw something in the dog's eyes. Loyalty, training, the silent plea of a soul who'd once known love. What happened next will restore your faith in miracles and in second chances. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. And if you believe that no creature should be thrown away, if you believe hope can be found in the most broken places, hit subscribe. Because this is a story you will never forget. Under the dim, pewter skies of Portland, the wind off the Willamette River carried the sharp scent of rain and the tang of distant pine. It was late November, the kind of cold that crept through every seam in your jacket, and the city wore its gloom like an old, familiar coat. Drizzle hung in the air, not a downpour, but a ceaseless, bone-chilling mist that clung to the city's faded brick and silver bridges. On the muddy east bank, where the river curved past rows of crumbling warehouses and the neon flicker of an all-night diner, two souls crossed paths, both lost, both stubbornly alive. Franklin Wade moved slowly along the shoreline, a large canvas sack slung over his bent shoulder. Franklin was 68, skin the color of roasted coffee, his face mapped with deep creases and an untrimmed gray beard. His frame was tall but stooped from years of hard work and harder nights. He wore 3 layers of threadbare shirts and an old army jacket with the name tag worn smooth, boots split at the toe and patched with duct tape. His hands were big and rough, scarred from a lifetime as a carpenter in another life, before illness and tragedy had swept everything away. Now, Franklin scavenged the waterfront for bottles and cans, hacking through each breath with a rattling cough, a legacy of the cold Oregon winters and a stubborn case of pneumonia that never quite left. He was a quiet man, rarely speaking unless spoken to, but his eyes, muddy brown, patient, carried a silent gentleness. He had learned the slow wisdom of kindness, how it cost nothing to offer a nod to another soul lost in the rain. It was just before dawn when Franklin noticed the movement in a pile of driftwood and trash beneath the broken pilings of Dock 6. A dark shape, curled tight as a question mark, shivered among empty beer cans and a tangle of fishing line. At first, Franklin thought it might be a raccoon or a fox, something wild and half-starved. But as he approached, the animal raised its head and met his gaze with wary, golden-brown eyes. The dog was a German shepherd, though barely recognizable as one. He was large, but his ribs stood out in harsh relief beneath a filthy, tangled coat of black and tan. His right ear drooped at a strange angle, old scar tissue white against the fur, and his hind leg dragged slightly when he tried to stand. Franklin knelt, moving slowly. The dog didn't growl, just watched him, tail curled tight around his feet, body tense with suspicion but too exhausted to run. Franklin spoke, his voice rough but gentle. "Hey there, big fella. What happened to you?" The dog answered only with a deep, trembling sigh. Franklin reached into his sack and pulled out half a stale baguette. He tore it into small pieces, placing them at arm's length. The dog inched forward, hunger winning out over fear, and swallowed the bread in trembling gulps. "You got a name?" Franklin asked quietly, though he knew the dog wouldn't answer. "You look like you've been through hell." He noticed a faded collar under the matted fur, but no tags, just a frayed scrap of blue nylon, as battered as its wearer. Franklin coughed, then winced and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "I ain't got much, but I can share," he muttered, dropping the last piece of bread. "You stick with me for a bit. Can't promise it'll get better, but you won't be alone." As dawn broke, the mist softened the edges of the world, and Franklin gathered his bag, standing with a groan. He beckoned, and the dog, uncertain but hopeful, followed, limping in his shadow along the slick path between river and city. Franklin spoke as they walked, his words quiet but steady. "You remind me of someone, you know. Old friend of mine, a dog from way back, used to follow me around the lumber yard. I called him Shadow because he was always there, no matter how tough it got." He paused, looking down at the battered shepherd beside him. "Maybe that's what I'll call you too, if you don't mind. Shadow. Seems right. We're both just ghosts moving through this world, huh?" The name seemed to settle over the dog like a gentle blanket. and for the first time his tail thumped once against the wet pavement. Their journey that day was slow. Franklin and Shadow became an unlikely pair wandering through Portland's forgotten corners, the back lots behind grocery stores, the steam-warmed grates behind the bus station, the benches under the leaky shelter of the Hawthorne Bridge. Franklin scavenged, pausing often to cough or rest, while Shadow limped loyally at his side. Sometimes Franklin would speak, telling stories of the city as it once was, better times, lost friends, old love. Other times he simply sat with the dog in silence, sharing what little food he managed to find. By noon, they reached a block of abandoned shops with a mural of blue herons faded by rain. There, a small figure darted behind a dumpster, a skinny boy of about 7, wearing a jacket 2 sizes too big and scuffed red sneakers. His name was Sammy Nguyen, the youngest child of a Vietnamese single mother who cleaned houses by day and worked a night shift at the laundry by the river. Sammy was quick-witted, small for his age, his dark hair sticking out from under a battered baseball cap. He had bright, curious eyes and a mischievous smile. Sammy was a regular visitor to these back alleys, often sneaking crusts of bread or broken cookies from home to feed stray cats and dogs. He had seen Franklin before and trusted the old man not to scold or chase him away. "Hi, Mr. Franklin," Sammy whispered, emerging from the shadows. "Is that your dog now?" Franklin smiled, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening. "Not sure yet. He might be, if he wants to." Sammy looked at Shadow, who regarded the boy with calm curiosity. The boy reached into his pocket and produced a slightly squashed piece of chicken. "Here, doggy." Shadow sniffed Sammy's fingers, then gently accepted the treat. Franklin ruffled the boy's cap. "Thanks, Sammy. You keep bringing food, you'll have a whole zoo back here one day." Sammy grinned, but worry flickered in his eyes. "Mama says I shouldn't give food to animals, but he looks so sad." Franklin nodded. "He's had a hard life, like a lot of us. Sometimes a little kindness is all a soul needs to get through." As the afternoon wore on, Franklin and Shadow wandered further, sheltering under the awning of a boarded-up hardware store when the rain picked up. Franklin's cough grew worse, and Shadow pressed close, offering what warmth he could. When Franklin dozed in the damp, Shadow stood guard, watching the world with wary, amber eyes. By evening, the pair found themselves beside a burned-out food cart, Franklin pulling a faded wool blanket from his sack to wrap around his shoulders and drape over Shadow. He whispered, "See, Shadow, it's not so bad sharing the night. Even if tomorrow's cold, at least we got each other now." For the first time, Shadow leaned his battered head into Franklin's lap, closing his eyes with a long, shuddering sigh of contentment. Franklin absently stroked the dog's scarred ear and looked up at the rainy sky. "Long as you're here, I won't be afraid." As Portland's city lights shimmered off the rain-slicked streets, 2 shadows, 1 man, 1 dog curled together under the same patchwork blanket. In the dark, neither felt quite so invisible. The days that followed were harsh even by Portland's November standards. The rain seemed endless, sometimes pounding, sometimes whispering, but always present, seeping into bones, clothing, and hope. Franklin and Shadow made their way through the city's alleyways and empty lots, their bond deepening with each hour, but so did the weight of hunger and illness. Shadow adjusted to life with Franklin quickly. The old shepherd became fiercely loyal, always close at his side, never wandering far, even for food. In the gray light of dawn, Shadow would curl tightly against Franklin beneath whatever awning they found, using his battered body to block the wind. As the days passed, a thin gleam began to return to the dog's amber eyes, and his gait lost some of its limp, though he still carried himself with the careful vigilance of a creature who had learned to expect the worst from the world. But Franklin's health was failing. His cough grew deeper and more violent, racking his body until his hands shook. Some nights the two would huddle together beneath an abandoned train car, and Shadow would lick Franklin's hand, as if trying to soothe the pain with his presence alone. Food grew scarcer. The shelters were full. Franklin had little luck with work. His old skills were of no use to a man without a phone or a mailing address, and the city's odd jobs vanished with the cold. One morning, after a particularly rough night, Franklin awoke to a tightness in his chest that wouldn't let go. His breath rattled, and a wave of weakness washed over him as he sat on a broken crate beneath the Morrison Bridge. Shadow watched closely, his head tilted, as if he understood. Franklin placed a rough hand on the dog's head and managed a weary smile. Don't look at me like that, old boy. I'm not giving up. Just tired is all. At that moment, a familiar small figure approached, carefully stepping around puddles. Sammy Nguyen, in his red sneakers and oversized jacket, carried a brown paper lunch bag and a determined look. He knelt beside Franklin and Shadow, his voice soft. "Brought you some crackers and cheese, Mr. Franklin," Sammy said, pulling out the bundle and offering it with two small hands. "Mama made too much." Franklin accepted with gratitude, breaking a cracker in half to share with Shadow. "You're a good kid, Sammy. Thank your mama for me." Sammy hesitated. He glanced at Shadow, who licked his lips and pressed his nose gently to the boy's hand. "I wish I could keep him," Sammy blurted. "If we had more money, or if Mama wasn't working 2 jobs, maybe she'd let me." Franklin's smile faded. "I know, son. Life's hard. Sometimes you gotta let things go, even if you don't want to." Sammy's mother, Mrs. Lin Nguyen, appeared a moment later, brisk and efficient. She was a petite woman, early 40s, with gentle but tired eyes and a cascade of dark hair tied up in a bun. She wore a faded floral blouse under her thick gray coat, her posture straight despite the burden she carried. Lin was a woman who didn't trust the city or its promises, and she was fiercely protective of her children. She gently but firmly called, "Sammy, come on, we need to go." When her eyes fell on Shadow, concern softened her face. "Franklin, that dog, he needs more than you can give. So do you." Her tone was not unkind, just realistic. Life had taught her not to hope for too much. That afternoon, as the drizzle thickened into a cold rain, Franklin and Shadow wandered through the bustling open-air market under Burnside Bridge. Vendors called out, hawking apples, day-old bread, odd trinkets, and steaming cups of coffee. Franklin's steps were slower than usual. His cough, now a constant companion, echoed against the stalls. He found a spot near the edge of the market, close to a stall selling battered used books and another with faded jackets. Franklin lowered himself to the curb, Shadow at his feet, and took a battered cardboard box from his bag. On it, with careful, patient strokes of a black marker, he wrote, $6 for a friend. He propped up the sign in front of Shadow and leaned back, exhaustion radiating from his every movement. Franklin hoped desperately that someone might see what he saw in the dog, the loyalty, the hurt, the hope that refused to die. The hours passed slowly. Some people glanced at the sign and shook their heads. Others offered a sympathetic look but kept walking. A few children stopped to pet Shadow, drawn to his gentle eyes and quiet demeanor. Shadow accepted each touch with stoic patience, never barking or flinching, only watching Franklin as if his entire world was right there on that curb. As dusk fell, the market began to empty. Franklin's chest burned with each breath, and he felt the creeping chill settling deep in his bones. A woman named Georgia, one of the bookstall vendors, in her late 50s, tall, with graying braids and a broad, open smile, brought over a paper cup of hot tea. Georgia was known in the market for her kindness and her habit of reading poetry aloud when business was slow. She handed Franklin the tea and smiled at Shadow. "He's got soul in his eyes," she said. "Wish I could take him, but my landlord barely lets me keep my cat." She left a biscuit for Shadow before returning to her books. Night fell quickly. Franklin wrapped his thin blanket around his shoulders and tried to keep Shadow warm with body heat. The city's noises receded to a dull roar. Shadow, sensing Franklin's fatigue, inched closer, his head resting on Franklin's lap. The old man whispered, "I'm sorry, boy. I wish I could do more. Maybe someone will see you for who you are." The market lights blinked off one by one. A few late-night stragglers passed by. Just as Franklin considered moving to a more sheltered spot for the night, a pair of police officers strolled through on their rounds, their boots slapping against the wet pavement. Franklin tensed, ready for a lecture or a warning to move along. Shadow looked up, ears pricked, as if recognizing something in their posture or their scent. But that meeting, and what followed, was for another day. The lights of the Burnside market glimmered against the puddles, turning every oil-stained pothole into a pool of wobbly gold. It was late, but a few vendors lingered, hoping to sell the last bruised apples or hand-knit scarves to night owls and students stumbling home. Franklin, bundled in his patched army jacket and thin blanket, shivered as the wind picked up. Shadow sat at his feet, patient and silent, his posture upright despite the exhaustion etched in every muscle. Shadow was striking even in his battered state, a large male German shepherd, maybe 9 or 10 years old, his black and tan coat dulled by mud and hunger, but his frame still powerful under the grime. His eyes were sharp, amber and alert, as if always scanning for the next order or danger. The right ear drooped, scarred from some old injury. There was a nobility in his stance, a memory of pride and training, not yet erased by hardship. Across the street, 2 police officers walked side by side. Officer Mark Evans was taller and broader than his partner, with a square jaw, short brown hair with a streak of gray, and steady blue eyes that missed little. He wore the night shift uniform navy jacket, black boots, badge catching the light. Mark had been with the Portland PD for over a decade, respected for his calm in chaos and his quiet sense of humor that sometimes broke through his reserved shell. Lately, though, there was a tiredness to him, a haunted air, as if he carried too many nights like this one. His partner, Officer Lila Martinez, was younger, Latina, sharp-faced with thick black hair pulled into a no-nonsense braid. Lila was full of nervous energy and relentless curiosity. She loved her work and often tried to get Mark to talk about his past, though he rarely obliged. As they neared Franklin's corner, Lila wrinkled her nose. "You want to check on him?" she asked, glancing at Franklin and the sign, $6 for a friend. Mark shrugged. "He's not causing trouble." His gaze swept past, but then something stopped him. An instinct, or maybe just a memory. He slowed. Shadow, sensing the uniforms, straightened, ears twitching, head rising in a way that felt uncannily precise. The old shepherd locked eyes with Mark. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to narrow. Cop and dog, 2 creatures marked by duty and loss. Shadow held Mark's gaze, then almost imperceptibly shifted his posture, chest out, back straight, tail still. It was the stance of a K9 awaiting orders. Mark's breath caught. Lila noticed the exchange. "He's well trained, huh?" Mark nodded, his voice low. "That's not just any stray." He knelt down, rainwater soaking through his pants, and reached out a hand, palm up. "Hey, buddy." Shadow inched forward, sniffed Mark's fingers, then sat, lifting a paw as if by old command. Mark swallowed, caught between awe and grief. His own K9 partner, Titan, had died the year before, old age and old wounds. Since then, he'd kept his heart locked tight against the world of working dogs and all the loyalty they offered. Franklin coughed, drawing their attention. "He's a good dog, officer, deserves better than this. I tried, but—" His voice trailed off into a raspy whisper. Mark looked at the sign, then at Franklin's face lined with weariness, eyes shining with concern. "You selling him?" Franklin hesitated, then nodded. "He needs a home, somewhere warm, someone who'll understand him." He placed a gentle hand on Shadow's back. "He saved me, you know, in more ways than one." Mark dug into his pocket and pulled out a 5 and a single, pressing them into Franklin's hand without a word. The exchange was quick, almost secret. Mark's voice softened. "I'll take good care of him. You have my word." Franklin's shoulders sagged in relief and sorrow. "That's all I wanted." He ruffled Shadow's fur, his big hand trembling. "Be good, boy. This man will look after you now." For a moment, the old man's eyes glistened. "Maybe you'll finally get to go home." Nearby, Sammy watched from behind a pile of crates, hugging his knees to his chest. He wore a blue hoodie with a torn sleeve, his small face streaked with dirt and worry. He'd followed his mother to the market, and when she wasn't looking, had snuck over to say goodbye to Shadow. Now, as he watched the dog walk away with Mark, his lower lip quivered. Shadow glanced back, nose twitching, as if recognizing Sammy's scent. The boy bit his lip and wiped his eyes, hiding the tears. In the distance, Mrs. Lynn called out, her voice sharp with exhaustion, and Sammy scurried away before she saw him. Lila watched the whole scene with a mixture of confusion and sympathy. "You're really taking him?" Mark nodded, standing. "He deserves it." He clipped a spare lead onto Shadow's faded collar and stood, the dog immediately falling into step beside him, like he'd done it all his life. Franklin lingered on the curb, staring after them. Georgia, the book vendor, approached and placed a hand on his arm. "That was the right thing, Franklin," she murmured. "He'll have a chance now." Franklin nodded but didn't trust himself to speak. He simply sat, wrapped in his threadbare blanket, the city lights blurring in his tired eyes. Mark led Shadow through the market, the rain easing for a moment as if in benediction. Lila grinned, scratching the dog behind his ear. "What'll you call him?" she asked. Mark hesitated, then said softly, "Shadow. It fits." And as they walked away, the old shepherd lifted his head, eyes bright. There was a hint of pride in his step, as if remembering another life, a life of service, loyalty, and hope. For the first time in a long while, Mark felt something warm unlock in his chest, the sense that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone. Mark Evans lived in a modest, second-story apartment in a weathered old building just a few blocks from Laurelhurst Park. The windows rattled in the wind, but the place was clean and quiet, smelling faintly of cedar and the strong black coffee Mark brewed every morning. That night, as the city rain continued its eternal whisper, Mark gently coaxed Shadow up the cracked steps and into the soft light of his home. Shadow paused at the threshold, amber eyes scanning the unfamiliar space years of caution and instinct at war with his aching need for warmth. Mark crouched and waited, letting Shadow make the choice. At last the shepherd stepped over the threshold, tail wagging tentatively. Mark smiled, a rare, honest expression. "That's it, buddy. Welcome home." He set out a bowl of water and a plate of shredded chicken, then drew a thick old towel from the bathroom. With slow, careful hands he knelt and began to clean Shadow's fur, working through the grime and mud. The old dog stood perfectly still, shivering at first, then slowly relaxing under Mark's gentle touch. In the clear kitchen light, Shadow's injuries stood out, thin scars crossing his flanks, a white ridge of tissue around his neck where a collar had once choked. Mark washed each paw, murmuring encouragement. "You've seen some things, haven't you?" he said softly. "Me too." When he finished, Shadow shook himself and stood, regal again, coat glimmering with dark gold and black beneath the lamplight. Mark reached for the vet kit he kept for emergencies, perks of a career often ending with scraped knees and bitten fingers. He checked for wounds, cleaned minor cuts, and gave Shadow a gentle rub-down. The shepherd bore it all stoically, licking Mark's knuckles in silent thanks. Later, Mark spread an old sleeping bag near the radiator. Shadow turned in 3 circles, some ancient dog magic, before collapsing with a long, grateful sigh. Mark watched for a while, coffee in hand, the apartment filled with an unfamiliar but welcome sense of peace. The next morning dawned brighter, a break in the rain revealing patches of watery sunlight on the hardwood floor. Mark brewed coffee and scrambled eggs, sharing bites of toast with Shadow, who now watched every move with hopeful, steady eyes. There was a weight in Mark's chest that felt lighter than it had in years. Later that day, Mark leashed Shadow and set out for a walk. They wound through quiet side streets, past the local hardware store and the bakery where Mark sometimes bought day-old bagels for the precinct. Each time they neared Burnside, Shadow's pace quickened. The old dog would strain gently at the leash, tail high, sniffing the air with a growing urgency. Mark noticed, puzzled, but let the shepherd lead him. As they reached the edge of the open market where Franklin had once sat, Shadow stopped, searching every face. His tail wagged in anxious little flicks. His ears pricked with hope. The market was quieter now, early in the day. Vendors stacked crates, steam curling from hot dog stands. Mark recognized Georgia, the bookseller, her tall frame wrapped in a rainbow scarf, reading a tattered mystery novel. She looked up and waved. "That him? The hero?" Mark grinned, nodding. "He's got a new home." Georgia smiled warmly, then added, "Franklin's not been around. Said he was feeling poorly last I saw." A pang of worry crossed Mark's face. He let Shadow guide him deeper into the market. Suddenly, from behind a stack of empty boxes, a ragged cough echoed a deep, wet hacking that seemed to shake the morning. There, huddled on a wooden bench, sat Franklin. His gaunt frame looked smaller somehow. The old army jacket hung on him like a curtain. His face was drawn, gray with exhaustion, his eyes sunken with fever. Shadow lunged forward, whining with recognition, tail beating the air. Franklin looked up, confusion flickering into joy as he saw his old friend. "Hey, boy. Look at you. All cleaned up." Mark knelt beside Franklin, concern furrowing his brow. "You all right, sir?" Franklin tried to smile, but his chest convulsed in another fit of coughing. "Just a cold," he rasped, waving it off. But his breath wheezed in his lungs, and a tremor shook his hands. Mark noticed the signs immediately. He was no stranger to illness years, as a street cop had taught him how easily pneumonia or bronchitis could become fatal when you had nowhere safe to recover. "You need to see a doctor," Mark said quietly. "You got anyone? Any family?" Franklin shook his head, pride and weariness warring on his face. "My son's in California. Haven't heard from him in years." Mark hesitated, then placed a hand on the old man's shoulder. "Let me help. There's a clinic down on Belmont. I can take you." Franklin started to protest, but a look from Mark, gentle, firm, silenced him. Mark fished a small card from his wallet, info for a shelter, his own cell written in neat blue ink. "Promise me you'll go, or let me come back and take you myself." Franklin took the card, fingers trembling. "Thanks, officer. I did my best for him." He scratched Shadow's ears, tears pricking the corners of his eyes. "You take care of each other, you hear?" At that moment, a small form darted behind the vendor stall's Sammy, the boy with the too big jacket and haunted eyes. He had been watching, worried, ever since Shadow had disappeared from the streets. Now, seeing the shepherd beside Mark, Sammy froze, half hidden behind a crate of apples. His heart pounded. Would Shadow remember him? Did the dog still care? Shadow caught Sammy's scent, ears swiveling, head tilting in recognition. He gave a single soft bark, tail wagging. Sammy's fear melted away, replaced by a bright, hopeful grin. He approached slowly, hands outstretched. "Shadow?" The dog nuzzled into his hands, licking Sammy's palms, and the boy giggled, relief sparkling in his eyes. Mark observed the exchange, a faint smile touching his lips. "You two know each other, huh?" Sammy nodded, cheeks pink with excitement. "I used to bring him food when he was with Mr. Franklin." Mark knelt, meeting Sammy's gaze. "He's got a home now, but you can come visit. Maybe help walk him if you like." Sammy's eyes widened. "Really?" Mark nodded. "Really? He likes you." Nearby, Georgia looked on, her smile as warm as the sunshine breaking through the clouds. Franklin, coughing quietly, watched the three-man, boy, and dog finding comfort in their small, makeshift family. For the first time in days, he let himself believe that things might get better, that kindness could ripple outward, connecting lives in unexpected ways. As the sun broke fully through the gray, Mark, Shadow, and Sammy walked away together, the old shepherd striding at their side, head high, a soldier restored to honor. Franklin sat quietly, warmed by the simple hope that somewhere, someone cared. Rain returned to Portland in thick, heavy curtains, turning the streets to glass and painting the windows with shifting rivers of light. Mark Evans watched the storm from his kitchen, fingers drumming anxiously against the countertop as Shadow slept at his feet, breathing slow and steady. The memory of Franklin's pale, drawn face haunted him. He'd seen too many good people, old soldiers, mothers, even fellow officers, fall through the cracks of this city. Mark knew he couldn't let Franklin be one of them. That morning, Mark called the city's social outreach line and explained Franklin's situation. He spoke with Ms. Sarah Ellison, a caseworker with a voice full of resolve and compassion. Sarah was in her early 50s, tall and thin, with short silver hair, steel-rimmed glasses, and deep-set green eyes that missed nothing. Years in the trenches of Portland's social services had given her an unshakable patience and a quiet fire. She spoke with both authority and empathy. "Officer Evans," she said, "thank you for looking out for Mr. Wade. I'll have a team check the markets this morning and get him seen by a doctor right away. Is there anything else you think he needs?" Mark hesitated, thinking of the pride in Franklin's eyes, the loneliness etched in every line of his face. He won't ask for much. He just needs someone to see him, really see him, and if it's possible, let him keep his independence. Sarah promised to do what she could, and before noon she called back with an update. Franklin had been found sitting near the old clock tower, soaked and shivering. The team brought him in. He'd protested, of course, but too weak to fight, and the clinic's nurse, Mrs. Rebecca Mason, set to work. Rebecca was a kind, bustling woman in her 40s, always wearing bright floral scrubs and a tiny gold cross at her neck. She was short and solidly built, with warm brown skin and a laugh that filled the room. She took to Franklin at once, soothing him with gentle words and the kind of brisk, no-nonsense care that made even the hardest souls yield. Shadow seemed to sense something had changed. That evening, as Mark put on his rain jacket, Shadow began to whine, pacing restlessly at the door. Mark laughed softly, clipped the leash, and let the shepherd lead the way through puddle-laced streets to the community shelter near Burnside. The center was a low brick building with hand-painted murals of birds and trees along its walls, a beacon for the lost and weary. Inside, the air smelled of oatmeal, disinfectant, and the faint, dry tang of old books. Mark found Franklin in a small room at the end of the hallway, propped up on a cot with a blanket over his knees. He looked tired but clean, a healthy flush returning to his cheeks. His beard had been trimmed, and his hair, once wild, was neatly combed. On the nightstand, a battered copy of The Old Man and the Sea sat beside a mug of tea. God. When Shadow entered, his tail began to wag in great sweeping arcs. He bounded across the room and leapt onto Franklin's bed, paws dancing, nose burrowing into the old man's hand. Franklin laughed, a dry, rasping sound full of relief and wonder. "Well, would you look at you? You clean up better than I do." Shadow licked Franklin's face, pressing his body close, refusing to let his old friend out of reach. Sarah Ellison peeked in, clipboard in hand. "He's been waiting for you two all morning," she said, smiling warmly at Mark and Shadow. "We'll keep him here as long as he needs, maybe even help him get into some permanent housing if he wants." Franklin squeezed Sarah's hand, eyes bright. "Thank you, ma'am. You and Officer Evans here can't remember the last time someone did right by me." Sarah blushed and shrugged, her practiced composure softening. "That's what we're here for." In the corner, another visitor waited, Sammy, in his blue hoodie and two big sneakers, carrying a carefully folded old dish towel. The towel, faded and patched, still held the faintest scent of Shadow, a talisman from the dog's nights on the street. Sammy crept to the bed, eyes shy but shining, and handed the towel to Franklin. "For you, Mr. Franklin. I thought you might want it. Smells like home, kind of." Franklin accepted it like a gift of gold, hugging Sammy gently with one arm. "You're a good kid, Sam." Shadow, seeing his old friend and his young one together, wagged his tail harder, licking Sammy's cheek. For a moment, all three simply sat together, a quiet circle of warmth and gratitude amid the bustling shelter. As the day wore on, Mark and Sarah took care of paperwork and checked on other residents. Mark watched as Shadow and Franklin napped together on the narrow bed, the dog's head pillowed on Franklin's chest. The old man's breathing, though still wheezy, was steady. Rebecca Mason peeked in periodically, tutting at Franklin's reluctance to take his medicine but always leaving a cookie on his nightstand. Outside, the rain finally let up. Sunlight broke through, slanting across the mural outside. In the community garden, Sarah knelt to water the late roses, while inside, Mark found a sense of belonging he hadn't felt since Titan, his lost canine partner, was alive. He wondered if it was possible that the world could make room for second chances, for healing in unexpected forms. That evening, as the city glowed pink and gold beneath the clouds, Franklin sat up in bed, holding Shadow close. He gazed out the window at the wet streets and whispered, "I never thought I'd see the day, good people, a roof, old friends." Shadow wagged his tail, thumping against the blanket. In that small, sunlit room, hope felt like something tangible, something you could hold on to. The air in Forest Park was sharp and alive with the scents of wet earth, pine needles, and moss. After weeks of drizzle, the forest had become a cathedral of green, the ferns unfurling along hidden paths and the great Douglas firs holding centuries of rain in their branches. Here, away from city noise, Mark Evans felt himself breathing more deeply, walking in rhythm with Shadow through the winding trails. The old shepherd had made a habit of pulling Mark toward the deeper woods, his nose to the ground, always alert. Shadow seemed younger in the forest. His black and tan coat caught what sunlight managed to break through the leaves. His stride was confident, tail waving as he darted ahead and circled back, but Mark noticed a pattern. On every walk, Shadow grew restless as they approached a certain fork in the path near an old creek. There, half hidden behind blackberry thickets, stood a forgotten wooden cabin, its roof sagging, the windows clouded with grime. Ivy wrapped the porch railings, and moss blanketed the stoop, as if nature were trying to erase what remained. The first time they passed, Shadow had frozen, ears pricked, body rigid. Then he'd burst forward, barking sharply at the door, his entire frame vibrating with urgency. Mark pulled him back, thinking it a fluke. But on every return, Shadow repeated the ritual, lunging at the cabin, barking, then circling the structure, nose pressed to the boards. Once, Mark heard a faint answering whine from within. The sound unsettled him, lingering in his mind long after they'd returned home. That Saturday, the clouds broke for a rare day of sun. Mark decided to return to the park with Shadow, and for the first time, invited Sammy to join them. Sammy arrived at the meeting spot near the trailhead, his blue hoodie zipped up tight, eyes sparkling with anticipation. "Are we really going into the deep woods?" he asked, glancing at Mark and Shadow with a mix of nerves and excitement. "We are," Mark smiled, handing Sammy a water bottle. "Just stay close to us, okay?" Sammy nodded, walking carefully, mimicking Mark's quiet footfalls. He watched Shadow with awe, seeing the shepherd's focus, the way he tracked scents and listened to the forest. As they neared the familiar fork, Shadow suddenly bolted ahead, making a beeline for the abandoned cabin. He stopped at the porch, barking furiously, his tail rigid, hackles raised. Mark called out, but the dog ignored him, staring at the door as if waiting for it to open by magic. Sammy stepped closer, curiosity overcoming fear. "What's he barking at?" he whispered. Mark shook his head. "I'm not sure, but I think we should find out." He stepped onto the porch, Shadow circling him, sniffing furiously at the gaps in the floorboards. The cabin smelled of mildew and old wood. The door was locked, but a pane of glass had been shattered, and Mark could just make out the shapes of stacked boxes and a tangle of blankets inside. Sammy pressed his face to the window, squinting. "I think I see something moving, over there by the fireplace." Shadow barked louder, then began scratching at a spot near the back wall. Mark knelt beside the dog, feeling along the floor for a draft. There, a faint puff of cold air. Mark's heart thudded. He searched the boards and, with Sammy's help, found a section that lifted with a groan, revealing a dark, narrow opening, a cellar window, half obscured by leaves and mud. "Look," Sammy breathed, pointing. "It goes under the house." Mark fished out his phone and used the flashlight to peer inside. Shadows shifted in the darkness, and then a glint of eyes. The weak, hoarse sound of a dog barking, then several more, muffled and desperate. Mark's blood went cold. He climbed down, Sammy holding the door open, Shadow whining anxiously above. The cellar stank of urine, fear, and old meat. 4 wire crates lined the walls, each holding at least one dog, dirty, trembling, some whimpering, some silent and resigned. The dogs' coats were matted, ribs visible. In the dim light, Mark could make out a shepherd mix, a chocolate lab, a terrier with a mangled ear, and a brindle pit bull curled in a corner, staring at him with huge, haunted eyes. Mark moved quickly, his training taking over. He checked the locks on each crate, cheap padlocks, easily broken with the multi-tool he kept on his belt. "It's okay," he murmured to the dogs. "We'll get you out." Sammy's voice trembled from above. "Should I call someone? The police?" Mark nodded, voice tight. "Yeah, call this number." He scribbled the precinct dispatch line on a scrap of paper and handed it up. Sammy darted outside, dialing with shaking fingers, doing his best to explain what they'd found. Shadow pawed anxiously at the entrance, whining low in his throat. Mark let him jump down, and the shepherd went from cage to cage, pressing his nose to each frightened animal, tail wagging gently, a silent promise that help had come. Within 20 minutes, the forest trail buzzed with activity. Officer Lila Martinez was the first to arrive, hair tucked under her cap, eyes wide with disbelief. She hugged Sammy with relief and clapped Mark on the back. "You always find the strangest trouble," she teased, her smile thin but grateful. Animal control arrived soon after, led by Mr. Harold Grant, a burly man with a thick red beard and a voice that carried across the woods. Harold was known for his devotion to animals. Rumor said he lived with 6 rescued cats and 2 dogs of his own in a small house on 23rd Avenue. He worked methodically, unlocking crates and carrying the weak dogs into the sunlight, murmuring reassurance with each careful movement. Neighbors began to gather near the trail, drawn by the sirens. Among them was Mrs. Eileen Parker, a retired librarian with kind eyes and silver hair pinned up with a blue comb. Eileen had lived in a cottage near the park for 30 years and often fed the strays who found their way to her back steps. She offered Mark and Sammy sweet tea from a thermos, her gentle presence soothing everyone's nerves. As the last dog was lifted from the cellar, Mark took a final look around the cabin, spotting old bags of cheap kibble and stacks of dirty blankets, evidence of someone using the place as a makeshift prison for stolen or abandoned animals. Lila snapped photos for evidence, her mouth set in a grim line. Sammy stood in the sun, arms wrapped around Shadow, tears bright in his eyes. "We did it, didn't we?" he whispered. Mark ruffled his hair, pride and relief mingling in his chest. "Yeah, kid, we really did." Night fell on Forest Park in a hush, the trees casting long shadows as clouds raced across a half-moon. The police tape was still wrapped around the abandoned cabin, but the discoveries from that afternoon had ignited something urgent in Mark Evans and the Portland PD. In the station's low-lit briefing room, Mark stood before a map covered in thumbtacks and scribbled notes. Lila Martinez sat at his side, reviewing photos on a battered laptop, her dark braid hanging over one shoulder. Beside the door, Harold Grant waited with a thick folder of animal control records. Their faces were tense, determined. No one wanted to let the perpetrators slip away. Captain Troy Howard, a stocky man in his mid-50s with sharp eyes and a clipped gray mustache, called the meeting to order. Troy wore his old uniform jacket with an air of authority, every movement crisp and direct. "Evans, your lead on this. Tell us what we're looking at." Mark explained the signs tracks, food deliveries, the hidden cages, and described the moment Shadow had recognized the scent outside the cabin. "Whoever's behind this, they're coming back tonight. They move dogs in and out under cover of dark." Lila nodded, clicking through surveillance images. "We saw a white van 2 nights ago. Plates were muddy, couldn't get a read." As midnight neared, Mark double-checked his vest and clipped his badge to his belt. Lila and Harold prepared tranquilizer kits in crates in the back of the animal control truck. Shadow, freshly bandaged from a scratch on his flank, wore a reflective harness and seemed to sense the gravity of the night. He sat beside Mark's cruiser, gaze unwavering, tail tapping with nervous anticipation. Across town, Sammy Nguyen sat at his bedroom window, watching the clouds drift above the city's glow. He clutched his battered flashlight, heart pounding. When his mother finally fell asleep, Sammy slipped from his apartment, racing through quiet streets to the park's edge. He would not miss this. At the shelter, Franklin lay awake, radio pressed to his ear, listening for news. He couldn't sleep worry, and hope had tangled inside him, and he prayed for all those left in the dark. Just after 1 o'clock, the operation began. Officers moved in quietly, surrounding the cabin and neighboring sheds. Mark let Shadow off the leash, trusting his instincts. The shepherd crept forward, body low, nose twitching as he traced old trails through the brush. Suddenly, Shadow froze, then shot forward with a low, urgent bark. Mark followed, gun drawn, with Lila covering the side entrance. They found the back door unlatched inside. Faint whimpers rose over the musty air. The ringleader, a gaunt man named Ray Mercer, emerged from the shadows. Ray was in his late 40s, tall and thin with pale skin, stringy brown hair pulled back in a greasy ponytail, and hollow cheeks. He wore a filthy flannel jacket, his eyes cold and cunning. When he saw Mark and Shadow, Ray snarled, lunging with a metal pipe. Shadow leaped, intercepting the blow, his teeth flashing in the moonlight. Mark moved fast, tackling Ray and snapping cuffs on his wrists as Lila secured the room. Inside the cabin, chaos reigned. 10 cages lined the walls. Inside, dogs of every shape and color barked, whimpered, and pressed against the wire. Some were puppies, wide-eyed with terror. Others were old, grizzled veterans, resigned to whatever fate awaited. Shadow, limping but undaunted, pushed at a fallen beam, freeing a terrified terrier trapped underneath. Outside, Sammy darted through the fence line, helping guide the smaller dogs toward the open gate, his small frame a beacon for the scared animals. "Come on, this way," he whispered, his voice fierce with purpose. Harold and his team worked quickly, lifting dogs into waiting crates, checking each one for wounds. Ray Mercer spat and struggled, glaring at Mark. "They're just animals. No one cares." Mark's eyes blazed. "You're wrong. You'll never hurt them again." In the rush, another man, a stocky accomplice in a faded hoodie, tried to slip away through the back. Shadow lunged, pinning the man to the ground, a deep growl in his chest. Lila was there in an instant, cuffs ready, adrenaline shining in her eyes. "You've got nowhere left to run." One by one, the dogs were carried into the safety of the animal control van. Neighbors, drawn by the sirens and barking, appeared at the edge of the woods, Mrs. Eileen Parker among them, her hands clasped in silent prayer. The community watched in awe as Shadow returned, limping slightly, bloodied but triumphant. The children who gathered knew him now as a hero. Mark knelt beside his old friend, cradling the shepherd's head. "You did it, Shadow. You saved them all." Later, as the dawn broke over the city, the news swept through the shelter. Franklin heard first. His hands shook as he listened to the reporter announce the rescue. The old shepherd, they said, led the charge. Wouldn't back down, not for anything. Franklin wiped his eyes, pride swelling in his battered chest. At the scene, Sammy hugged Shadow's neck, laughing and crying. Mark and Lila surveyed the cabin empty now except for memories and evidence. "We couldn't have done it without him," Lila said, her voice thick with admiration. Mark nodded, tears stinging his eyes. "He's the bravest soul I've ever known." The morning after the rescue dawned bright and gold, sunlight pouring across Portland's rooftops as if the whole city exhaled in relief. News of the night's events traveled quickly. "Hero dog leads police to dramatic forest rescue," the headlines read, accompanied by photos of Shadow battered but unbowed standing tall beside Officer Mark Evans and the grateful community. At the precinct, the break room overflowed with donuts and coffee sent by neighbors, and Mark found himself the recipient of 1,000 handshakes and claps on the back. In the center of the commotion, Captain Troy Howard made an announcement. Troy, with his familiar clipped mustache and a crisp white shirt beneath his navy jacket, smiled as he called for everyone's attention. "We owe a debt to this dog. Shadow isn't just a hero, he's the heart of this team. I'd like to offer him a Badge K9, honorary division." The room erupted in applause. Mark looked down at Shadow, who sat at his heel, gaze solemn and proud. But as the officers cheered, Mark's thoughts turned to Franklin, to that first night in the rain, to everything Shadow had endured and given. He knelt, scratching behind the shepherd's scarred ear. "What do you think, boy? Want a badge or a home?" Shadow licked Mark's hand, his amber eyes soft. Mark stood and faced the captain. "Sir, with your permission, I'd like Shadow to retire with his family. With Franklin Wade, he's earned his peace." There was a quiet hush. Then Captain Howard nodded, voice thick with emotion. "That's the best idea I've heard all year." More applause. Mark felt a weight lift from his chest, a chapter closing, another just beginning. Within days, arrangements were made for Franklin and Shadow to live together in a small, sun-filled room at the community center. The room was simple, a twin bed, a battered armchair, a window that caught the afternoon light. But for the first time in years, Franklin felt at home. He'd gained a new family. Sarah Ellison checked in every day, sometimes bringing books or a hot meal. Rebecca Mason, the nurse, stopped by with treats for Shadow and cookies for Franklin, and Mark visited whenever his shift allowed, always bringing Shadow's favorite ball and a shy, grateful puppy, the youngest survivor from the forest rescue, now christened Benny. Benny was small and scrappy, with tufts of white fur and eyes that glimmered with mischief and trust. Shadow's wounds healed. He became a gentle giant at the center, loved by the residents and staff alike. He would lie at Franklin's feet as the old man carved tiny wooden dogs and painted them in every color he remembered from his youth. Sometimes, at dusk, Franklin and Shadow strolled the garden path, old bones moving slow but steady, two silhouettes stitched together by the simple grace of belonging. Sammy came by after school nearly every day, always with a snack or a story. At first, he tiptoed in, still shy around adults, but soon he grew bold, walking Shadow and Benny through the halls, sometimes joined by his mother, Lynn. Lynn Nguyen, once wary and world-weary, now volunteered at the center twice a week, reading to the residents and helping with meals. She and Franklin would laugh about their childhoods, finding comfort in shared struggles. The greatest change bloomed in the old neighborhood, where Mark, inspired by Shadow's courage and the rescue's publicity, helped organize a monthly adoption fair. Neighbors who once hurried past the rundown blocks now stopped to ask about volunteering, bringing bags of kibble, blankets, or simply sitting to stroke a nervous rescue dog's head. Mrs. Eileen Parker, the retired librarian, became the unofficial dog grandma, arriving every Saturday with her famous ginger cookies and a new batch of library books. Shadow and Franklin often visited the shelter, checking on the other dogs they'd helped save. Shadow seemed to know each by scent, greeting them with gentle wags and patient nuzzles. Benny, the puppy, would bounce around their feet, tail whirling, always first to find the softest blanket or the kindest lap. One warm afternoon, Mark sat with Franklin on the community center's porch, Benny curled up in his lap, Shadow dozing at their feet. He could have been anything, a police dog, a mascot, a legend, Mark said quietly. but he just wanted someone to come home to. Franklin smiled, lines crinkling at the corners of his kind eyes. That's all any of us want, son. A place to belong and someone to walk with. He reached down, stroking Shadow's graying head. We saved each other, I think. Mark nodded, glancing out at the garden where Sammy and Lynn were laughing, helping Eileen set up another table for the next adoption event. The air was full of life barking, laughter, the promise of second chances. And so, Shadow found rest at last, not just as a hero, but as a friend, a guardian, and a beloved member of a family forged in hardship and hope. His legacy rippled out, a quiet miracle, turning a once-forgotten neighborhood into a place where kindness flourished, where no one, man or dog, would ever be left behind again. At the heart of Shadow's story is a lesson as old as time. Miracles are real, and they often begin with small acts of compassion offered by ordinary people who choose to care. When Franklin reached out to a broken dog, when Mark refused to give up on a forgotten soul, when a community gathered to rescue the lost, something greater moved among them. Some may call it luck or coincidence, but those who believe know these are the quiet workings of God's love in our world. In everyday life, it's easy to forget that a single kind gesture can change everything. Maybe you feel unseen, or maybe you see someone else who is struggling. Remember, God works through each of us. Even the smallest kindness, a smile, a shared meal, or a listening ear, can be the miracle someone needs. Like Shadow and Franklin, we are never truly alone when we choose love. If this story touched your heart, please share it with others. Comment Amen below if you believe in second chances and in the miracles God gives us, and subscribe to join a community that believes every soul deserves hope. May God bless you and everyone you love, today and always. Share the story, comment Amen if you believe in miracles, and subscribe for more hope-filled journeys. May God's grace be with you.